Growing up, Nadine Caron dreamed of becoming a basketball star until a chance meeting with a surgeon changed her mind. It put her on a path to becoming Canada's first female First Nations surgeon and an innovator in getting diagnostic tools to the northern British Columbian communities that need them. Dr. Nadine Caron is a professor of medicine at the University of British Columbia and co-director of their Centre for Excellence in Indigenous Health. And we're very pleased to welcome her back to our studio tonight. It's good to see you again.
Great to see you.
You haven't been here in a few years.
It's been quite a few.
Yeah. You don't write, you don't call. No, that's our fault. Well, I'm not going to pretend this is the most original question you've ever heard off the top here, but I do want to know, is it a big deal to be Canada's first ever female First Nation surgeon?
Is it a big deal? I don't think it actually has anything to do with me at all. I think the big deal is that I just relatively recently, I don't think I'm that old, I graduated from the surgery residency program, in 2003. I think that's the big deal. I think the big deal is that it took till 2003 for Canada to have a First Nations female general surgeon.
What does that say in your mind?
It says that, I think it's a reflection of historically, the history that we're actually trying to deal with more actively now in Canada with respect to where education was, where the social determinants of health were, where we are economically as an Indigenous population. And I think now we're starting to make up these gaps, and the gaps are everywhere you look, including opportunities. And so I think the fact that I was the first is more a reflection of what wasn't there before, because someone was going to do it. There's nothing special about me. I think what's heartening in terms of recognizing is that there's more coming along the way now.
I'm going to push back a little bit on that, because there obviously, I'm sorry, you're wrong. There is something special about you to become the first in Canadian history. And 2003 was the year, eh?
Yeah.
So it took an awfully long time for that to happen.
Yes.
Does that disgust you in a way that it took that long?
Yeah, I try not to use the word disgust or egregious or it's...
But that's what you're thinking.
That's what I'm thinking. And, you know, and it was all the way along the way. Like when I was in medical school, I remember being told that I was the first female First Nations woman to graduate from the School of Medicine. And that was 1997. It's a long time to train to be a surgeon. And the same thing in terms of how long it takes for First Nations people to have had these opportunities. And there's a lot of gaps that remain unfilled that we're trying to fill, and we will eventually.
Do you think First Nations are being discriminated against when it comes to admission policies in post-secondary institutions?
I don't think it's discrimination anymore. I just think now that, you know, we've worked really hard at the University of British Columbia to create admissions programs across many of the areas, the Faculty of Medicine being a great example. So not discriminated again, but you have to sort of look way upstream. You have to create an environment where kids graduate from high school. They are encouraged to go on to post-secondary institutions. They have the support and the finances to be able to take that long step. I think I went to school 16, 17 years after high school. That's a long time and a lot of support and a lot of commitment from a lot of people to get me through that path.
In which case, how tall are you? No, come on, play with me here for a second.
5'9.5", 5'10" with my basketball shoes on.
Well, I was going to say, you know, yeah. if you stuck with basketball and played in the WNBA, you might be a lot richer and you might be having more fun. You never know.
Technically speaking, WNBA wasn't around when I was in basketball, so
okay.
Yeah.
So you probably took the right path.
I think so. I think so.
How does you can help me on this. I don't know if there's a particularly Indigenous way of practicing medicine that is very distinctive from how conventional medicine does its thing, but I am curious about how your background might inform the way you do what you do now.
Oh, that's a brilliant question. I think it does. I like to think it does, particularly when I have the honor of working with First Nations or other Indigenous patients, because there's a real need across the board in medicine to actually bring cultural safety and humility into the healthcare system. That's been shown, and it's well known to be a real barrier to the access and utilization for Indigenous people in Canada to use the healthcare system. So I think that connection helps me understand, helps me realize how important it is. You don't have to sell that to me. I think I still need to work at it, because just because I'm Ojibwe doesn't mean that I understand the Carrier or Sekani culture where I'm in northern BC, but I respect it. And I think that if we can just bring more respect into the healthcare system, it would be a much safer place in a very scary time for any individual who needs healthcare.
I think Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians alike would sign on to that. That's a very good goal. Well, while we're on this, let's do some more. Here's Suzanne Stewart's been a guest on this program a number of times in the past. She's director of the Wakabanis Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health, and we were actually discussing this very issue about Western versus Indigenous approaches to healthcare. Here's a little clip of her. Let's listen to this, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, roll the clip, please.
So the Canadian model of health and mental health is based on a Western European lens of health, which is a deficit model, an illness model.
Okay.
Indigenous models of health are not based on deficits. They're based on strengths and wellness, or what's called balance.
Can you amplify on that a bit? Is she onto something there?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's sort of the wellness model or the deficit model. And it's interesting. I always say, why do we call it the Ministry of Health when its whole focus is on sick people?
It should be the Ministry of Sickness Treatment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But definitely, and in British Columbia, where I get to work with the First Nations Health Authority a lot, they really do shift that sort of focus and looking at the wellness model and where they're putting their efforts. They're not putting their efforts at downstream. They're not forgetting about those responsibilities, but they're really shifting it towards wellness, to prevention, and even into screening in terms of early diagnosis or prevention in that way. But it's a different way of looking at it, not even in healthcare. Healthcare is one thing, sort of how do you prevent illness? How do you focus on wellness? How do you realize that you have to be well, not only in body, but in spirit and in mind? And but even how we look at things. You hear a lot about the disparities in health between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. But there's a lot of areas where I think Indigenous people are leading the way or have the very capacity to lead the way in health in Canada.
Go ahead, name one.
If you look at it, even when this whole thing about screening and prevention and the focus on that, that's what Indigenous people have been doing all along. If you look at the importance of diet, traditionally how we live off the land and our diet before the colonization and before the residential schools and before all of that. If I think about how my grandmother used to eat or my great-grandmother used to eat, very different, very healthy. And it took Western medicine to study something like diabetes and realize, whoa, Indigenous people, generally speaking, and First Nations say, have a huge rate of diabetes compared to non-Indigenous. But a fundamental difference is the diet, not the Indigenous diet. In fact, Jay Wortman, a colleague of mine, did a study looking at diet and Indigenous First Nations people having diabetes, putting them back on their traditional diet, what it used to be, and all of a sudden, all of those parameters that we care about in Western medicine with MD after our names start to improve by just fixing what we used to have.
Isn't that fascinating? So Western medicine would do itself well to take much more into account the ethnic backgrounds of the people that they are treating.
Absolutely.
Huh. Maybe even a little bit of the language. You speak Ojibwe?
You know, very, very, very little. I know how to say thank you, and that's the most important word in any language.
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth? Very good. Well, all right. Again, let me push back a bit on this. Doctors feel under assault everywhere today. I'm talking about, non-Indigenous doctors. Whether it's the federal government's tax plan or whether it's the contract negotiations with the Ontario government, whether it's whatever, patients seeking second, third, fourth, and fifth opinions.
Yes.
Doctors just really feel under the gun everywhere. I see it everywhere. Is it asking too much on Western-style medicine and Western-style doctors today to ask them to consider this added layer of understanding in order to make their practices better?
Oh, okay. You're lining up some brilliant questions. At UBC's Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, we've taken a hard look at this, And we're not unique. In Toronto, they are doing the same thing down the street from us, across the board, requesting or demanding Canadian physicians, whether born in Canada, multi-generation Canadian, or Indigenous, to understand and to study Indigenous history and pull in that extra layer, as you call it, in terms of cultural safety and humility into the healthcare system. I think it is a lot to ask, but if you want to be a physician in Canada and care for Canadians, I think that it's actually now fairly non-negotiable.
You just got to do it.
You've got to do it.
Well,
it's as important. You know what? You can carry around all these sort of electronic devices. If you want to know a mechanism of action of a pharmaceutical agent, if you want to know what the best antibiotic is, if you want to know what the latest guidelines are for someone having a heart attack, you can just bring them up on whatever phone you happen to be carrying. You cannot create an understanding of the individual who's in front of you, at least at a baseline level, to bring in that element that is a part of the country that you're living in. But on a phone, you have to put the time in to start to understand it, at least at a fundamental level, and to respect the need to have that information if you're going to be a physician or healthcare provider.
It is not an exaggeration to say this is a matter of life and death, what you're talking about. Sheldon, bring these numbers up if you would. Apropos of what we've been discussing and life expectancy in Northern Ontario, let's just compare these numbers, all from a report called Health in the North from Health Quality Ontario. If you live in Northwestern Ontario, your life expectancy is nearly 3 years lower than in the province overall. It is the same story in Northeastern Ontario, where life expectancy is 2.5 years lower. And the report also found that people in the North are more likely to die prematurely from suicide, circulatory, and respiratory disease as well. Now, you come to us today from British Columbia. Do you see many of these same metrics on the West Coast?
You know, I haven't seen metrics with respect to Northern British Columbia versus the others in this way. But I certainly can look at it from two different areas. One, as you move north in Canada, there is a higher percentage of Indigenous and First Nations, and even further north, the real north, the Inuit population. And we know, unfortunately, about the discrepancies in health status, everything from life expectancy to the various rates of disease. We know that. But as a healthcare provider, we just had a meeting with the Canadian Association of General Surgeons looking at the disparities in access to surgical services. And that applies to rural and remote Canadians. Even if you're along the 49th parallel, there are some places that you are a long way from urgent and emergent surgical care. And that's, in a way, some of the most scariest, because there is nothing that can be done in the middle, whether it's an emergency C-section, whether it's appendicitis, whatever it is, there's discrepancies in that area for sure.
My hunch is, given your training, you could easily have established a very wealthy practice somewhere near Stanley Park in Vancouver and done very, very well for yourself. But your focus is on remote and rural communities. How come?
You know what? It's what I care about. And this was an opportunity when I moved up to Prince George for the Northern Medical Program. I had the opportunity to go and move to a program that was just starting. I got there, I think, 2 days before the medical students did. And rural, remote, Northern, and Indigenous Canadians are the ones that are sort of marginalized on the outskirts, whether it's access to surgical services, whether it's utilization of the healthcare system, and whether it's the impact in the statistics that we see. That it would surprise people when they realize that in a country with universal healthcare, that it's actually not universal.
Okay, Dr. Caron, let's finish up on this because we'll do a little plug here. The Institute for Canadian Citizenship, that is the organization established by our former Governor General, Adrienne Clarkson, has brought you here to participate in the 6 Degrees Citizen Space. That's a 3-day event that's bringing people together, looking to kind of drive the global conversation on inclusion and citizenship. And the theme of your section is bridges. And I think we want to finish up on having you help us better understand how building bridges within the healthcare system and from the healthcare system to the rest of society is going to benefit everybody.
Well, it makes sense. It makes even more sense when you look at the 6 Degrees and it's a 3-day event. And one of the sections is actually on walls. And then we get to follow with bridges. And I was so excited that I got to be part of the bridges part because it's so optimistic and it's so what we need with respect to when you have diversity. Diversity in itself isn't a strength. It's the links between the individuals so that you feel proud to add to that diversity, that you don't need to be homogeneous, that you can be different. And you can sit in that space of being different, and you can share why you're different, and you can be safe in that difference. And building those bridges, whether it's being able to sit in that space tomorrow, down here in Toronto at 6 degrees, or whether it's being able to bring people together and have a discussion about what Canada means to us as a country. We are so proud of our diversity, but what it means on an international scale in terms of where we sit in this globe and how we're going to add to that diversity in the truest sense, meaning celebrating the differences, having it safe to be different, and being able to talk about that and figure out when there are differences of opinion that jeopardize our safety, whether it's differences in religion, differences in political beliefs, on an international scale or within our own communities. How can we talk about it? How can we come to a space where we don't need to agree? That's what diversity is all about. We don't need to agree, but we need to respect each other.
So I'm putting you down for bridges, not walls. Is that right?
I'm bridges. I'm bridges all the way. Yeah.
Gotcha. It's really good of you to make some time for us and come into our studio and share your thoughts. Thanks so much, and we shouldn't leave it so long until next time.
Thanks, Steve.
Dr. Nadine Caron, Canada's first female Indigenous surgeon and an associate professor at UBC.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.